There is a company right now building almost every new piston airplane that rolls out of an American factory and onto an American ramp. Not most of them, not a large share of them, almost all of them, depending on how you define the category and where you draw the line on what counts as a serious production aircraft versus a kit or a light sport or an experimental. One company, one production line in one city in one state. And if you're buying, owning, or operating a new piston aircraft today, that fact is shaping your experience in ways that go far deeper than just the sticker price on the showroom floor. This is not a story about whether that company makes a good airplane. They do. It's not a story about whether the people running it are competent or the engineering team is talented. They are. This is a story about what happens to an entire market ecosystem when manufacturing consolidates to the point where one player effectively sets the rules for everyone else, and what specifically happens to parts pricing, maintenance costs, service network dynamics, and long-term ownership economics when there is no meaningful competitive alternative keeping any of those things in check. Before we get into it, hit subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of structural market analysis that most aviation content never goes near. And if you want to understand what's actually happening to the economics of piston aircraft ownership, instead of just reading press releases and airshow announcements, this channel is where you want to be for that conversation going forward. Let me give you the lay of the land first, because the story of how we got to one dominant manufacturer is genuinely important context for understanding why parts pricing works the way it does today. And it's a story that runs through decades of general aviation history in ways that still echo loudly in every maintenance invoice you get. Go back far enough, and the piston aircraft manufacturing landscape looks almost unrecognizable compared to today. Cessna was building hundreds of new single-engine airplanes every year. Piper had a full lineup running from trainers through complex singles to twin-engine cabin-class airplanes. Beechcraft occupied the premium end of the piston market and was doing serious volume there. Grumman, Mooney, Rockwell, American Champion. There was genuine competition across multiple price points and multiple airframe philosophies, and that competition did what competition always does, which is keep any single player from having unchecked pricing power across an entire supply chain. Then came the liability crisis of the 1980s. Product liability lawsuits against aircraft manufacturers reached a level that was genuinely existential for the industry, and the costs weren't just in settlements and judgments. They were in the insurance premiums manufacturers had to carry, the legal reserves they had to build, the chilling effect on new model development because every new design was also a potential new liability exposure. Cessna stopped building piston singles in 1986. Piper went through bankruptcy. Production volumes that had once been measured in the thousands per year collapsed to a fraction of that. The General Aviation Revitalization Act in 1994 created an 18-year statute of repose that brought some manufacturers back, including Cessna, but the industry that came back was a fundamentally different animal than the one that had existed before. Smaller, more expensive, more cautious, and already beginning the long consolidation process that would eventually leave the piston new production market in the position it's in today. Cirrus entered that landscape as a genuinely revolutionary product. The SR-20 and then the SR-22 were not just new airplanes, they were a fundamentally different approach to what a modern piston single could be, with composite construction, a full glass panel as standard rather than retrofit, and most famously, the Cirrus airframe parachute system that changed the safety conversation around single-engine flying in ways that reverberated through the whole industry. Buyers responded. The SR-22 became and has remained the best-selling new piston aircraft in the world for essentially 2 decades running. It wasn't that Cirrus crushed its competitors through pricing power or distribution muscle. It won on the product, which is the right way to win. But here's where the story gets complicated. When you win that decisively, for that long, in a market that's already consolidating for structural reasons that have nothing to do with you, what's left around you matters enormously. Cessna kept building piston singles, but at volumes and price points that increasingly left the high end of the market to Cirrus by default. Piper rebuilt itself, but never returned to the sales dominance it had in the 1970s. Mooney went through ownership changes and production stops that ultimately ended with the company shutting down new production entirely. Diamond is building airplanes, primarily with diesel engines, primarily for the European market and for flight training, with a market presence in the US that's real, but significantly smaller than Cirrus. And the result, if you stand back and look at the production numbers for new piston singles being sold into the American personal aviation market at the price points where serious owner-pilot buyers shop, is something that functions economically like a monopoly, whether or not anyone describes it that way in their marketing materials. And monopoly economics, even soft ones, even unintentional ones, have consequences. They have consequences in parts pricing. They have consequences in service network structure. They have consequences in how maintenance facilities negotiate with manufacturers. They have consequences that every Cirrus owner feels every time they open a maintenance invoice, and increasingly, consequences that ripple through the broader piston market in ways that affect owners of other airplanes too. Let's start with the most direct and visible version of this, which is what happens to proprietary parts pricing when there's no competitive pressure holding it down. Every airplane has parts that are proprietary to that manufacturer. Components that were designed specifically for that airframe, that aren't interchangeable with anything else flying, and that can only be sourced from the manufacturer or from a supplier operating under the manufacturer's licensing and certification authority. That's true across all of aviation. It's not unique to Cirrus, but what's different about the current piston market is the degree to which Cirrus has moved toward a design philosophy that maximizes proprietary integration, and the absence of a competitive alternative that creates any external pressure on what they charge for those proprietary parts. Think about the composite airframe itself. The SR series is built from fiberglass composite rather than the traditional aluminum structure that makes up the vast majority of the legacy piston fleet. That composite structure is genuinely better in a lot of ways, smoother aerodynamically, corrosion-resistant, structurally efficient, and it enabled design features that a conventional aluminum build would have made much harder to achieve. But it also means that structural repairs require techniques, materials, and approvals that are specific to Cirrus composite construction, that can't be handled by the same sheet metal shop that's been repairing aluminum Cessnas and Pipers for 40 years, and that in many cases require factory-authorized repair processes that bring Cirrus directly back into the maintenance chain with significant pricing authority. A conventional aluminum airplane with hail damage or a ground strike can often be repaired by any competent airframe shop using standard sheet metal techniques, approved data, and parts sourced from a reasonably competitive supply chain. The same damage to a Cirrus composite structure almost always involves factory repair data, factory-approved materials in some cases, and a repair authorization process that has Cirrus or a factory-authorized center at the center of it. That's not a conspiracy. It's just what composite repair is. But the economic consequence is that the owner of that composite airplane has significantly less ability to shop around for competitive repair pricing than the owner of the conventional aluminum airplane down the ramp. Now layer onto that the avionics integration story, because this is where the proprietary dynamics get really interesting from a cost standpoint. The Perspective Touch avionics suite in a current Cirrus is deeply integrated into the aircraft's systems in ways that go well beyond what you'd see in a retrofit installation. The autopilot, the engine monitoring, the traffic and weather systems, the CAPS activation logic, the electronic stability and protection features, these are all talking to each other through an integrated architecture that was designed as a complete system rather than bolted together from independent components. That integration is genuinely great for the pilot experience and for safety. The Cirrus automation ecosystem works beautifully as a cohesive whole because it was designed to work that way from the ground up. But the maintenance and upgrade implications of that deep integration are significant. When a component in that integrated system needs replacement or upgrade, you're not just swapping one box for a compatible alternative. You're working within a software architecture and a certification basis that controls what can be changed, how it can be changed, who can change it, and what it costs to change it. Software updates that would be routine on a platform with an open or competitive avionics supply chain require going through Garmin and through Cirrus, with pricing set by a relationship where the owner has essentially no leverage whatsoever. Autopilot servos that fail get replaced with components sourced through a supply chain, where Cirrus and Garmin together determine the pricing, not competitive bidding among alternative suppliers. A display unit that starts having issues gets replaced at a price that reflects what the market will bear, because the market doesn't have a meaningful alternative to go to. To be clear, Garmin is present in many aircraft across the fleet, and the Garmin monopoly on modern glass panel avionics is its own separate and important story. But in most retrofit installations in legacy aircraft, there's at least some ability to choose avionics solutions from the competitive landscape, to go with Garmin or Avidyne or a mix. to upgrade incrementally rather than as a complete system. In the deeply integrated Cirrus ecosystem, that flexibility is substantially reduced, and the pricing reflects that reduced flexibility in ways that show up clearly on maintenance bills. Let's talk specific numbers, because this is where the theory meets reality and where owners start feeling the difference in their wallets. The Cirrus airframe parachute system is the single most distinctive feature of the airplane, and, for a lot of buyers, the primary safety reason they chose it over alternatives. It's also one of the clearest examples of monopoly parts pricing in action, because there is literally no alternative, no competitive option, no way to source this component from anyone other than Cirrus and its authorized suppliers. The caps, rocket, and canister require periodic replacement on an inspection and replacement schedule, and the cost of that replacement has moved in a direction that tracks much more closely with what a captive market will absorb than with what competitive market pricing would look like. A caps replacement that once felt like a painful but manageable scheduled maintenance cost has become a line item that owners increasingly plan their ownership budget around in a way that directly affects when and whether they can afford to keep flying their airplane. And there is no negotiating, no shopping around, no alternative supplier to call for a second quote, because none of those options exist. The costs associated with caps replacement run into thousands of dollars and climb meaningfully when you factor in the labor from a factory-authorized center and any associated inspections that get bundled into the maintenance event. Owners who do the math on their total cost of ownership before they buy are often running numbers that they got from other owners or from online communities, and those numbers can be meaningfully out of date because the trend on proprietary parts pricing from Cirrus has been consistently upward in ways that outpace general inflation and outpace what owners who bought several years ago were planning for. If you're looking at a Cirrus today and trying to model your ownership costs 5 or 10 years out, you need current numbers from owners actively paying for this maintenance right now, not forum posts from 3 or 4 years ago, because the trajectory matters as much as the current point on the curve. The same dynamic shows up across other proprietary components in the Cirrus maintenance ecosystem. Structural inspection requirements that require specific factory data access. Composite damage repairs that need factory authorization to complete, with a clean return to service. Software upgrades and avionics updates that move through a pricing structure controlled entirely by the manufacturer and its partners. Specialty tooling requirements for certain maintenance tasks that mean only certain shops can legally perform certain operations. Each one of these individually sounds like a normal part of owning a sophisticated modern aircraft. Collectively, they add up to an ownership cost structure that is substantially less influenced by competitive market forces than the ownership cost structure of a legacy aluminum airplane, and the difference shows up in real dollars over the course of real ownership in ways that are significant enough to affect buying decisions, trade cycles, and how long owners actually keep their aircraft. Now, here's a nuance that's important and worth sitting with for a moment, because this story isn't as simple as manufacturer bad, owner victim. Cirrus has made genuine investments in the ownership experience that have real value, and some of what looks like expensive proprietary pricing also comes bundled with legitimate support infrastructure that cheaper alternatives don't provide. The Cirrus Service Center network is a genuine network. Trained technicians, factory support, parts availability, consistent standards of service that you don't always get from independent shops working on older airplanes with varying degrees of familiarity with the type. The Cirrus Standardized Instructor Program has invested in training that has measurably contributed to the safety record of the fleet. The customer service operation, for a company that's not Boeing, is genuinely professional and responsive in ways that not every general aviation manufacturer can claim. So some of what you're paying for in that proprietary ecosystem isn't just captive pricing. It's a support infrastructure that has real costs and delivers real value. The question isn't whether the support infrastructure is worthless. It's whether the pricing is set by the value of that support or by the absence of competitive alternatives. And the honest answer is that it's some of both. And the absence of alternatives component has been growing as Cirrus's market position has become more dominant. There's also the question of what happens to that ecosystem long term, and this is where the economics get genuinely concerning for owners who are thinking about buying a Cirrus today and holding it for 15 or 20 years. Every proprietary ecosystem in aviation ultimately faces what's sometimes called the orphaned fleet problem. The manufacturer at some point stops supporting older versions of the software, stops making certain parts, sunsets certain components in favor of newer replacements that require upgrade investments to stay current. With a manufacturer that faces real competitive pressure, these decisions get made with at least some awareness that pushing owners too hard too fast risks driving them to alternatives. With a manufacturer who is effectively the only game in town for new production piston aircraft, the calculus looks different. Owners have no alternative production manufacturer to migrate to. They can only choose between paying for the manufacturer's upgrade path or flying an airplane that is increasingly unsupported and potentially unable to maintain its airworthiness for certain operations. That's not a hypothetical future scenario. It's a dynamic that's already playing out for older Cirrus aircraft, whose Avidyne avionics are no longer being actively supported, and whose owners are facing upgrade decisions where the cost of not upgrading may eventually exceed the cost of upgrading, but where the upgrade cost itself is substantial and controlled entirely by parties with no competitive pressure to moderate it. Let's talk about what this means for the independent maintenance shop ecosystem, because the pressures on small GA shops are important, and they don't get enough attention in most conversations about ownership economics. For most of the history of general aviation, the maintenance ecosystem that supported the aircraft fleet was diverse, competitive, and widely distributed. A Cessna 172 owner could take their airplane to any one of hundreds of shops across the country and get competitive service. Because the airplane systems were built on standards, the parts were available through distribution channels that any shop could access, and the technical information needed to maintain the airplane was in the public domain or available through normal licensing arrangements. That competitive ecosystem kept labor rates reasonable, kept parts markups in check, and gave owners genuine choices about where they spent their maintenance dollars. The Cirrus ecosystem erodes that competitive maintenance marketplace in several important ways. Factory authorization requirements for certain maintenance tasks mean that independent shops either invest heavily in Cirrus-specific training and tooling to stay competitive for this type, or they effectively exit this portion of the market. That investment makes sense for shops in markets where there are enough Cirrus aircraft to support the specialization, but it creates geographic concentration of authorized service capability in ways that reduce competitive pressure precisely where the airplane is most popular. An owner who lives somewhere that only has one or two authorized service centers within a reasonable distance has significantly less negotiating leverage on labor rates and significantly less ability to shop for competitive pricing than an owner of a conventional type with 10 shops in their region who can all do the work. The impact on the independent shop that specializes in older conventional types is also worth considering because the economics of general aviation maintenance have become genuinely challenging for these small businesses. As Cirrus has captured an increasing share of new aircraft sales over the past 2 decades, the composition of the active flying fleet has been gradually shifting toward a larger proportion of Cirrus aircraft and a smaller relative proportion of the legacy types. For shops that built their business model around aluminum Cessnas, Pipers, and Moonis, that shift means their addressable market is contracting relative to where it was, while simultaneously the barrier to entry for working on the growing segment of the fleet, the Cirrus population, is higher than it was for the legacy types. Some shops have made the investment and built Cirrus capability successfully. Many have not, either by choice or because the economics didn't support the transition. The long-term result is fewer competitive options for owners of both types, which is not a dynamic that serves anyone except the manufacturer who benefits from that reduced competition. Here's something that almost never gets discussed in polite company in the aviation community, but that is genuinely important to the ownership economics conversation, which is the relationship between Cirrus's market position and the trajectory of training costs. The Cirrus standardized training ecosystem, which is comprehensive and genuinely well-designed, is also entirely proprietary and entirely Cirrus-controlled in terms of pricing and structure. If you want to fly a Cirrus, you don't have to go through Cirrus-branded training, but the insurance community has increasingly been pointing pilots toward type-specific training and Cirrus-approved instruction as a condition of coverage or as a significant premium factor, and that market reality creates pressure toward the Cirrus training ecosystem that functions like a soft mandate even when it's not technically required. Cirrus standardized instructors charge what the market bears for a captive market, and the market for Cirrus instruction has increasingly become captive in a way that the market for Cessna or Piper instruction is not, because the supply of CF instructors is controlled through a Cirrus-administered program rather than emerging organically from the broader CFI community. This isn't to say that Cirrus training isn't valuable, or that CSIPs aren't good instructors. Many of them are outstanding. It's to say that when the training ecosystem for the dominant new production aircraft is controlled by that aircraft's manufacturer in a way that limits competitive alternatives, the pricing dynamics of that training will reflect that control over time. And they do. Recurrent training costs for Cirrus pilots through the manufacturer-adjacent ecosystem are higher than comparable training for conventional types, where the instruction market is broadly competitive, and those costs are a real part of the total cost of ownership that buyers who are focused on the sticker price of the airplane often underestimate significantly. Let me walk through what all of this looks like in practice for someone who's actually shopping for a new piston aircraft today, because theory is useful, but practical implications are what actually matter when you're trying to make a real decision. If you're looking at a new Cirrus SR-22 or SR-22T today, you're looking at a genuinely excellent airplane. The safety record, particularly for pilots who engage with the training ecosystem and use the automation correctly, is real and it's meaningful. The panel is extraordinary. The passenger experience is better than almost anything else in the certified piston world. The CAP system provides a genuine backup option that has saved lives and will save more. None of that is in dispute, and none of it should be dismissed. What you need to go into that purchase with is an honest, eyes-open understanding of what the ownership economics look like over a 10 or 15-year hold period, not just the first year or two. You need to talk to owners who have had their airplanes for 8, 10, 12 years, and ask them specifically what their annual maintenance costs have looked like, how those costs have trended over time, what they've spent on proprietary components and system upgrades, and whether the actual cost of ownership matched what they modeled when they bought. You need to call your insurance broker before you fall in love with the airplane and get actual current premium numbers based on your actual experience level, because Cirrus insurance costs have their own dynamics that vary significantly based on pilot history and hours in type. And you need to think hard about what your total cost per hour of flight actually looks like over your realistic ownership period, including CAPS replacement, engine reserve, avionics updates, composite maintenance, and training costs, because that number is the one that actually determines whether this airplane is affordable for your situation, not the sticker price divided by your expected hours. For some buyers, that honest analysis confirms the Cirrus is the right airplane and the economics are manageable. For others, it leads them back toward the used market, or toward alternative new aircraft where they exist, or toward a reconsideration of what their actual mission requires versus what they're being sold. None of those conclusions are wrong. What's wrong is buying without doing the analysis, because the monopoly dynamics we've been discussing mean that the costs of being wrong are less forgiving in this market segment than they would be in one where more competitive alternatives existed. Now let's broaden the lens a little bit, because the story of Cirrus's market position isn't just about Cirrus owners. It's about what that market position does to the entire ecosystem of general aviation economics, including for people who don't own and will never own a Cirrus. When one manufacturer effectively sets the price ceiling for new piston aircraft through their production and pricing decisions alone, that ceiling influences the entire market's perception of value. If the going price for a new 4-seat piston airplane in full IFR configuration is consistently in the range of $800,000 to over $1 million for the SR-22T and high-spec variants, that number becomes the reference point against which everything else gets evaluated. A used SR-22 from 5 years ago looks like a value relative to new pricing, because it is. A Diamond DA-40 or DA-50 looks reasonable relative to that ceiling. Even the used Cessna and Piper market gets influenced by the reference point set by new production pricing, because buyers who are trying to understand what airplane ownership should cost will inevitably use the new market as an anchor, even when they're shopping used. The problem with an anchor set by a market without genuine competition is that it may not reflect what prices would look like if there were multiple manufacturers competing for that buyer's dollars. There's no way to know with certainty what new piston aircraft would cost if there were 3 or 4 serious manufacturers competing aggressively for market share across the same performance envelope. But the basic economics of competition suggest they'd be lower than what the current environment produces. That gap between competitive and monopoly pricing, whatever it actually is a cost that gets borne by every buyer in the market, whether they're buying new or using new pricing as a reference to calibrate their used aircraft offers. Here's a related dynamic that affects the parts market for the broader piston fleet, not just Cirrus specifically, and it's one that doesn't get talked about enough. As manufacturing capacity in the piston aircraft industry has consolidated, the parts supply chain for legacy aircraft has also been under pressure in ways that are partly a function of how concentrated new production has become. Parts manufacturers who supply components to the GA industry need volume to survive. When production volumes across multiple manufacturers were higher, the supply chain had more diverse demand from more sources, which supported a broader base of suppliers and more competitive pricing. As production consolidated and overall new aircraft volumes in the piston market declined from where they were in earlier eras, parts manufacturers have faced their own consolidation pressures. Some suppliers have exited the market. Others have been acquired by larger players who rationalize their product lines and raise pricing on parts where they now face less competition. The result is that parts for legacy aircraft, your overhauled Cessna, your vintage Piper, have also gotten more expensive and in some cases harder to source than they used to be, partly as a downstream consequence of the manufacturing consolidation at the original equipment level. This shows up particularly clearly in certain component categories where PMA parts manufactured under a parts manufacturer approval, rather than directly from the original OEM, have historically provided meaningful price competition to type certificate holder parts. PMA parts have been an important mechanism for keeping maintenance costs on legacy aircraft manageable, because a PMA carburetor or magneto or brake assembly competes on price with the OEM equivalent and gives owners and shops a genuine choice. The PMA ecosystem requires its own minimum viable production volume to sustain, and as the number of active aircraft in certain fleet populations declines, and as the economics of running a PMA production operation have gotten harder, some PMA coverage has shrunk in ways that push owners back toward more expensive OEM parts without a competitive alternative. Now let's talk about where this goes from here, because this matters most as a forward-looking question. Is there a credible competitive threat to Cirrus's new production dominance on the horizon? Looking at the landscape honestly, the answer is complicated and worth thinking through carefully rather than giving you false optimism or unnecessary pessimism. Diamond Aircraft is building legitimate airplanes and has made real inroads in the training market with their composite, diesel-powered designs. But their U.S. market presence, while real, has remained significantly smaller than Cirrus for reasons that include their diesel engine focus, in a market that still has a lot of uncertainty around diesel piston reliability and service network depth. Their primary positioning toward flight training rather than personal owner-pilot flying, and the inherent challenges of competing as an Austrian manufacturer in the U.S. market against a company that's been building its dealer network, training ecosystem, and brand loyalty for over 2 decades. Diamond is a legitimate competitor, but they're not providing the kind of competitive pressure that would meaningfully constrain Cirrus's pricing authority in the market segments where Cirrus is dominant. Tecnam and a handful of other international manufacturers are making noise, and the Mosaic rule changes that expanded sport pilot weight limits have opened the door for some aircraft in adjacent categories to compete more directly with the lower end of the certified piston market. But for the performance envelope that most serious owner pilots shopping for a new personal airplane are actually looking at, cross-country capable, full IFR, 4 seats, room for actual luggage, the competitive options remain thin. Electric and hybrid aircraft are coming, and the most interesting long-term competitive question in personal aviation is whether a genuinely capable electric or hybrid electric 4-seat airplane can be certified, produced, and sold at a price point that creates real competitive pressure on the conventional piston market. If that happens, and if the battery technology and infrastructure issues we've discussed in other contexts can be resolved, it would fundamentally change the market dynamics we've been describing. But the timeline for that to be a real competitive factor, rather than a compelling demo aircraft and press release, is meaningfully longer than the optimistic announcements have suggested, and Cirrus's market position is unlikely to face serious disruption from that direction for at least another decade in any scenario that takes the certification and infrastructure realities seriously. The most realistic near-term competitive pressure on Cirrus's parts and ownership economics may actually come not from a new competitor, but from the growing owner community itself, and from the third-party maintenance ecosystem. Cirrus owners are organized, connected, and increasingly vocal about ownership economics in ways that create some degree of market pressure even without a competing manufacturer. Organizations like the Cirrus Owners and Pilots Association aggregate owner experiences in ways that document cost trends over time and create negotiating context that individual owners couldn't develop on their own. Independent Cirrus-capable shops that have made the investment in type training and tooling are increasingly available in more markets, and while they operate within Cirrus's authorized framework for certain tasks, they bring some degree of competitive pressure to labor rates and service pricing that pure factory-only service wouldn't face. There's also a growing body of knowledge within the Cirrus community about what maintenance can legitimately be deferred, what can be done at independent shops versus what genuinely requires factory authorization, and how to navigate the ownership cost structure in ways that minimize unnecessary spending without compromising airworthiness. That accumulated owner knowledge is real, it's valuable, and it moderates some of the worst impacts of the monopoly economics by giving individual owners better information to make decisions with. But it doesn't change the fundamental dynamics. It just helps owners navigate those dynamics more skillfully. What does meaningful long-term change in this market actually require? Let me be direct about this, because I think it matters, and because the honest answer is harder than the version most people prefer to tell. Real competitive pressure in new piston aircraft requires a manufacturer with the capital to absorb a long product development and certification cycle, the engineering talent to produce an airplane that's genuinely competitive with the Cirrus on safety, capability, and panel, the distribution network to reach buyers across the U.S. market effectively, and the willingness to price aggressively enough to actually take market share rather than occupy a comfortable niche. All four of those things need to be true simultaneously, and finding a combination that satisfies all four at once is genuinely hard in an industry where certification costs are high, production volumes are low relative to other aviation segments, and the brand loyalty of existing Cirrus owners creates real retention advantages for the incumbent. The economics of piston aircraft manufacturing are not kind to new entrants. The certification burden alone, even with improvements that have come through initiatives like FAA modernization, represents a capital commitment that most investors view skeptically, given the market size. The product liability exposure that cleared out the market in the 1980s hasn't disappeared. It's been modified by the statute of repose, but it's still a real cost that any new manufacturer has to plan for and insure against. And the Cirrus brand, the training ecosystem, the owner community, and the safety record have all created a loyalty flywheel that gives the incumbent advantages that pure product quality doesn't capture. These are not insurmountable barriers, but they're significant ones, and anyone who says a serious new competitor is likely to emerge and shake up the market in the next 5 to 7 years should probably walk you through more specifically how they think that happens, because the obvious obstacles are genuinely substantial. So where does this leave the actual aircraft owner or prospective buyer who's trying to make practical decisions with real money? A few things are clear from everything we've walked through here, and I want to be as direct and practical about these as possible because they actually matter for the decisions you're making or will be making. First, if you're buying a new Cirrus, price in the proprietary ecosystem costs from day one, and be conservative rather than optimistic in your estimates. Caps replacement, avionics updates, composite maintenance, and Cirrus-specific training costs are all going to be influenced by a manufacturer with significant pricing authority and no competitive alternative, forcing them to be reasonable. The numbers you get from current owners who are actively paying for this maintenance right now are worth more than any estimate you'll get from a sales presentation, and you should seek out multiple data points from owners with airplanes at different ages to understand how the cost trajectory changes over time. Second, if you're buying a used Cirrus, recognize that you're buying into the same proprietary ecosystem on parts and maintenance, but potentially without the remaining warranty coverage and potentially with more near-term scheduled maintenance events to budget for. The lower purchase price of a used Cirrus relative to new is real, but the ownership cost structure is not as favorable as the same spread would be on a conventional aluminum airplane, where the used discount translates more directly into lower total cost of ownership. Third, if you're shopping for new piston aircraft and considering alternatives to Cirrus, be honest about what alternatives actually exist in the performance class you're targeting, and be willing to look hard at models that might not have the same brand recognition or social presence, but that offer genuine value in the market environment we've described. Diamond-certified models deserve serious consideration from buyers who have done their homework on the diesel engine reliability picture and who are flying in environments where jet fuel availability is as good or better than avgas. Certain European manufacturers with U.S. certification have products worth evaluating seriously, and the used certified market at certain price points represents genuine value that the new aircraft pricing environment has made more attractive than it's been in a long time. Fourth, If you're already a Cirrus owner and planning to hold your airplane long-term, getting educated about your options within the maintenance ecosystem is genuinely worth your time. Understanding which shops are authorized for which tasks, which maintenance events have some scheduling flexibility versus which are hard regulatory requirements, and how to build relationships with multiple authorized shops in your region to create at least some competitive dynamic on labor pricing. All of that can have a meaningful impact on your actual ownership costs over a multi-year hold period. The manufacturer's pricing authority is real, but informed owners navigating the ecosystem skillfully consistently report better outcomes than owners who simply accept the first quote they get from the most convenient authorized center. Fifth, and I want to close with this because I think it's genuinely underappreciated, the health of the broader general aviation market over the long term depends on the piston new production segment having more competitive dynamics than it currently does. This isn't an abstract economic argument. It's a practical observation about what healthy, growing markets look like versus what stagnating, consolidating ones look like. When new aircraft cost is set by a single manufacturer with no competitive check, when parts pricing trends consistently upward ahead of inflation because there's no alternative for owners to go to, when the maintenance ecosystem becomes increasingly structured around factory-controlled service relationships rather than broadly competitive independent shops, the long-term result is an activity that gets progressively less affordable for progressively fewer people, and a pilot population that stays flat or shrinks rather than growing to replace the people who are aging out. That's bad for everyone in aviation, including Cirrus. A growing, healthy pilot population needs entry points that are economically accessible. It needs a maintenance ecosystem that's broadly competitive and competent. It needs ownership cost structures that reward long-term holding rather than making every year of ownership progressively more expensive through an escalating proprietary parts bill. And it needs the competitive pressure that makes manufacturers innovate on product and value rather than on pricing power. None of that exists in meaningful form right now in the new piston market, and the consequences are visible in the ownership economics of the people actually flying these airplanes today. This is not inevitable and it's not permanent. Markets that look like permanent monopolies have faced unexpected competitive disruption throughout history, sometimes from directions that no one anticipated clearly in advance. The electric propulsion story is real, even if the timeline is uncertain. The mosaic regulatory changes have opened doors for new configurations and new aircraft types that didn't exist before. International manufacturers face a different and potentially improving regulatory environment for entering the U.S. market than existed a decade ago. None of these are certainties. But the direction of change in the regulatory environment, in the technology, and in the economic pressure on buyers is pointing toward a market that will look meaningfully different in 15 to 20 years than it looks today, and some of the competitive dynamics we've described here will be different along with it. In the meantime, the practical reality is what it is. One company builds most of the new piston airplanes being sold into the American personal aviation market. That company sets the pricing floor for new production, the reference point for used aircraft valuation, and the ecosystem terms for maintenance and training in ways that no competitor is currently positioned to meaningfully constrain. Owners who understand that dynamic and plan for it carefully can navigate it and own these airplanes with their eyes open. Owners who buy into the story without looking hard at the economics first tend to be the ones who find themselves surprised by maintenance invoices 5 or 8 years in that they didn't budget for and can't easily avoid. Be in the first group. Do the math before you fall in love with the airplane. Talk to owners who are currently living with the costs, not just the ones who are still in the honeymoon phase of a recent purchase. And if you're in the market for a new piston airplane and you're willing to look beyond the dominant brand, spend serious time with the alternatives that exist, because the competitive landscape, thin as it is, does offer genuine options in some performance categories, and those options may represent meaningfully better long-term ownership economics than the alternative for certain buyers and certain missions. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this entire conversation, it's that price on the ramp is not the same as cost of ownership, and that the gap between those two numbers is larger and more influenced by market structure rather than just product complexity in the current new piston market than at almost any point in the history of general aviation. Understanding that gap before you sign anything is not optional. It's the single most important thing you can do to protect yourself financially as an aircraft owner in the market environment we actually have right now. Drop a comment below with what your actual ownership experience has looked like if you're flying a Cirrus or evaluating one. I want to hear the real numbers from people actually living with this, because aggregate data from real owners is worth more than any estimate I can construct from here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, and this kind of structural, honest analysis of where the aviation market actually is versus where the industry wants you to think it is matters to you, now is the time to do that, because there's a lot more of this kind of breakdown coming, and you don't want to be finding it after the fact. Fly safe, and I'll see you next time.